Welcome back, everybody. As I was saying earlier, it is great to have you all here for our second day of education. Yesterday, we talked about the big stuff. And today, we're moving over to our first specific topic, which is, agriculture, the food that comes out of the soil. And just introductory comments here. Food is complicated, and truly, in this presentation, we are only scratching the surface. There is so much more to learn, and this is part of sustainability that is constantly changing. The answers are not necessarily black and white. It is nuanced, so don't expect to have like the perfect solution for everything here. Today, we're going to learn a lot of important terms, and then we're going to look at some of the basic systems. And remember that the whole idea here is that the population is growing substantially, and we have to produce more food, but we have to do it without using more land and without creating more greenhouse gases. And that's tough because agriculture is very resource intensive. So one of our goals of this whole thing that we're doing is that we want to create curious, inquisitive chefs and food professionals who are always looking for answers. So let's jump into today. Again, this is what we're going to be looking at. A little bit of the current situation. We're going to look at some of the solutions and then talk really about how we can make change and how we can improve things. So from soil to supper. So everything is connected. Everything is an ecosystem. Every time we put something in the ground, we are creating and changing the ecosystem. And the substrate, the base of all of the ecosystems is soil, because soil is effectively the thing that gives life. And one of the great things we have to be looking at is the health of our soils. What are we doing to the soils by the ways that we are producing food? Because without healthy soil, it's very difficult to grow food in a healthy manner and one that is sustainable. So within the soil, we have, many microorganisms, bacteria, fungi, etc., that support life and the nitrogen, etc., that plants need to grow. So it is one of the things that we could study a lot more, but never lose track of the fact that soil is the basis of agriculture. So sort of jumping into today, what we have is what's called an industrial food system, by and large. And an industrial food system effectively takes the idea of growing food and putting it into a manufacturing sort of rubric. And so the idea is to grow more food at lower costs with lower inputs, etc. And frankly, it has been very successful if you look at it from that perspective, because we are now able to grow enormous amounts of food with minimal labor and often much lower prices to the consumer. Now remember that not all the crops that are grown are for human consumption. In fact, a lot of it is actually grown to feed animals. And increasingly, there's been a movement to have crops that are used for other things, such as producing fuels, ethanol, etc., to be able to power machinery. But while industrial food has created incredible gains in terms of the amount of food available, there's also been, sort of costs that go with this. And these are oftentimes referred to as what are called hidden costs. They're things that we don't see. They're the results of the decisions that we make in how we grow our food. So let me talk a little bit about what the industrial food system is, if you were to sort of characterize the way that it happens. So the first is specialization. And this means that what we're gonna, growers will specialize in one specific crop or two specific crops, but instead of growing a wide range of products, they'll grow one or two. And of course, this achieves maximum efficiency because that's how factories work. Now, the opposite, as we'll see, there are some, there's kind of pros and cons to all of our decisions. The cons here is that we lose biodiversity and we lose some of the natural synergies. So simplification here also is, how do you, when you specialize, what you're trying to do is make everything as simple as possible, which leads into mechanization. Again, in trying to achieve maximum efficiency, what we try to do is increase the number of machines and thus have less people in the fields. Standardization is a major tenet of this. And standardization, which we're going to talk about in the following slides, is, if I grow tomatoes, I want all my tomatoes to look the same, to be the same size, to be the same color, etc. Now, of course, the problem is in the real world, when you grow something, not every tomato is exactly the same size, the same color, the same, etc. And this actually leads into a topic we'll talk about on the last day, which is food waste. Because there are large amounts of food that are discarded because they don't fit the standardization model. And of course, that was done, to standardize, to allow for food to be shipped and stored long distances and for long periods of time. Consolidation is another major tenet of the industrial food system, and that is replacing small farms with increasingly larger ones, or a series of farms that are owned by one large company. Again, this is something that is the result of or part of the industrial food system. So we're going to go through a number of terms here, which I think are important that we know and we define, because you hear these a lot in discussions about sustainability. The first is monoculture. And a monoculture is part of what we just talked about, which is the sort of standardization to achieve efficiency. And monocultures basically means when you look out at wide areas of farmland, many times you will see the same crop everywhere, whether it's wheat growing or corn or cotton or rice, etc., soybeans. You will see these enormous farms with just one crop that's growing. And typically, these are grown with the assistance of insecticides, herbicides, and also large amounts of fertilizers. Thank you. It's early in the morning here. Interestingly enough, in the United States from 1948 to 2008, the usage of agricultural chemicals increased more than 5 times. So you can see that monocultures rely on inputs, chemical inputs, to continue to do what they do. In the old days, here in the States and other parts of the world, people rotated crops. And they rotated crops because certain crops take out the nitrogen from the soil, which plants need. And then they would change or move the crops around and plant things like legumes, which are called nitrogen fixing plants. They put the nitrogen back into the soil. But if you're just growing one crop over and over and over, something like corn, for instance, you will deplete the soil relatively quickly if you don't put in things like fertilizers. Now, the issue with monocultures is that we are losing biodiversity, and we're going to talk about that on the next slide. But the other thing is it's inherently risky. And the reason I say this is that, remember from yesterday, in a world of climate change, where climate change results in weather patterns that are not predictable, that tend to move towards the extremes, monocultures are fragile. And if something goes wrong, you could lose an immense amount of potential produce. So the next slide is really about biodiversity. And as I mentioned on the previous slide with monocultures, one of the issues is that as we move into this, or have moved into this industrial agricultural system, what happens then is that we specialize, and we specialize in growing the same thing. And as you can see there from the first bullet point, 90% of the global food supply comes from 15 plant and animal species, which is absolutely incredible when you think about that. Because when we lose biodiversity, a number of things happen. Again, we need to put it, well, one of the issues there is that we lose the ability to react. Now, and there have been some very interesting studies about this, where if the climate is changing, it may be better to be growing multiple foods in the same area. But when we lose biodiversity, especially if they are completely lost, we lose the ability to react. Now, around the world, there are interesting, things like seed banks, etc., that are trying to save as many of the species as possible. And this is a really good thing, because as our climate is changing, it's very helpful to go back to other crops and have options to use. So losing biodiversity is really a very, very serious thing. We can also see some examples there, including most recently the Cavendish banana, which is the banana species that is pretty much represents all of the global exports. And here we have created a monoculture globally. And now that there is, and has been going on, a fungus that is uncurable, we actually risk losing the banana supply. And that's something that continues to threaten not just the bananas, but it also threatens literally millions of people whose lives are linked to that crop. So yesterday, remember when I said that in the beginning comments that everything is connected? Everything really is connected. And we're going to see this come up on day number 4 also when we talk about seafood. But everything is linked together. So what I'd like to talk about here are what are called dead zones. And you can see the dead zones in red and in yellow around the world. And what that basically means is when people put fertilizer on their fields, what happens is excess fertilizer runs off the field, and then it runs into streams, and streams go to rivers, and rivers go to bigger rivers, and eventually those rivers deposit that nitrogen, that fertilizer, into the ocean. And what happens then is that there are algae blooms that happen that feed off of this. And the result is that the algae then consume the oxygen in the water. Now, clearly fish and other sea creatures need oxygen to survive. And so what happens effectively is you create deserts underwater where nothing is really growing because of the farming and the effects of fertilizer. So everything is truly connected. And in many instances, these dead zones are growing year over year, which is particularly difficult. And we'll see that in the day on seafood. Pesticide treadmill. So we put lots of pesticides on our fields. And again, some of this is needed, because if pests consume our plants, that is, of course, a problem. But at the same time, it also creates this circle where we put pesticides on our fields, and then eventually the pests will mutate, and they will then become resistant to those, and then we have to come up with new pesticides or other pesticides or put more on the field, etc. So it does tend to turn into this sort of rotating application of different pesticides. And of course, pesticides can have negative health effects, not just for the creatures that they're supposed to kill, which obviously we want, but even within the field, many times pesticides have also killed other animals that we want to keep healthy. One of the big ones, and there's been a lot of discussion about this, is the worldwide bee population. And we need bees as the pollinators to be able to pollinate the plants. If that doesn't happen, we're in serious trouble. So pesticides don't only kill the pests, but also can have effects on other insects, etc., on birds, etc., and on human health. And I think that one of the things we have to look at, and by the way, I want to be sure I say that, I said at the beginning of this, that I don't want you to walk away from this and say all pesticides are going to kill me. There are pesticides that are much better on the environment, that are organic, etc. And there's other ways to go about doing this. But please, pay attention to the pesticides that are used. And of course, do your best to, when you get them, wash the food, etc. And we're going to talk about at the end of this presentation a little bit about knowing who your suppliers are and how they farm. And I think this is a really important question in terms of what types of pesticides and when and at what point in the growing cycle are they applied to the different crops. So GMOs, genetically modified organisms, is something that has attracted a lot of attention, and there's been much debate about their safety, etc., why we even have them in the first place, etc. So, I just want to sort of give you a little bit of the pros and cons here. But what GMOs mean is that the crops contain or the crops basically have genes that were changed in some way or another. There was a lot of press around putting different organisms' genes into certain organisms, etc. And that does happen, but it's also getting in and altering the genetic makeup of a particular plant to turn certain things on or to turn certain things off. That all fits under the heading of genetically modified organisms. And clearly, GMOs were initially done to fit the industrial model. They were also done to actually, be able to use less pesticides and herbicides on the fields. And there's been a lot of work that's been done on GMOs to solve certain problems. Because remember, we still have this issue of how do we grow more food on the same amount of land with less inputs for a growing population, and in a climate that's changing. And so there's been a lot of work as to how we can solve that using GMOs and new strains of different produce. So the people in favor of the GMOs will say it's reduces labor, more convenience, increased yields, less chemicals needed, and improved nutrition. And also, and when I say increased yields, that has to deal with the changing climate. And the opponents will say, well, we create the super weeds, we create, there are safety concerns potentially, and what about the chemicals that are used with modified plants? The famous one, of course, is one called Roundup, in which the plants are genetically altered to resist it. But at the same time, the herbicide then kills the things around it. And what is the effect of that on the general ecosystem and its reduction of biodiversity? So there's, again, as I said in the beginning, agriculture is fraught with nuance, and I think this is one of them. So general resource depletion. Now this kind of takes a little bit larger look at agriculture and what do we need to grow food? Well, we need all of the things in the bullet points over there, and every one of those are in jeopardy right now. So for instance, the amount of fertile soil. Remember, if we were to grow more food, 56% more food, we would need the area equivalent to 2 Indias just to grow food for the population by 2050. That's a huge thing. And at the same time, we have a lot of farmland where the fertile soil has been degraded to the point where it doesn't yield large amounts of crops. And that is a problem. Water, we're going to address on day number 6. The water crisis is huge. 70% of the world's water, fresh water, goes into the production of food. 70%. And as the world changes with climate change, et cetera, that will become more and more difficult. Fossil fuels are needed in large amounts to create fertilizers and, of course, to power all the machinery that produces the food. Stable climate, we talked about that a bunch yesterday, and of course, a stable national and international politics / economics. That is something that today continues to be problematic with trade barriers, etc. And all of that prevents food from being produced and distributed like it needs to be. So if we kind of look a little differently at what ecological agriculture looks like, it's basically a way to minimize the soil erosion, to keep the fertile soil, to build its fertility. Remember, everything starts with the ground. It's a way to conserve fresh water, to use less water, to protect the water quality, so we're not polluting it. We're not putting excess fertilizers into the water, which create dead zones. Protect biodiversity, etc. That's a different type of farming. Now, one of the things that's not talked about a lot is that we are also losing farmland across the world. And we're losing farmland because cities are sort of gobbling them up as cities grow. The projection for numbers of people that'll be living in cities by 2050 is huge. And remember that many of these cities that were originally founded were founded because there was fertile growing land close to the city. Well, as these cities grow, they eat up that very fertile land, and we have less good quality land to be able to grow our food. Interrelationships, this is really just going back to that whole concept of everything is related. And as we go through this presentation, we'll talk about energy. Well, energy affects food prices. If oil goes up, food prices go up. If weather is increasingly volatile, food prices go up. We do monocropping, we put pesticide use, we lose biodiversity. Everything is connected. And many of these changes will disproportionately affect the poorer people. And this is particularly difficult because if the price of oil goes up and food prices go up, populations that don't have the money to be able to buy those foods, etc., that becomes a bigger and bigger issue. So now we move into this whole concept of what is organic agriculture. And organic is something that has been tossed around a lot. Let me just say, first of all, that the word sustainability or sustainable agriculture has no legal definition. Local agriculture has no legal definition. I could say local means my house. I could say local means, 500 kilometers away. There's no definition. Organic does have a legal definition. And what organic means is that there are lists of what you can and what you cannot do in terms of your growing practices, in terms of the fertilizers, et cetera, that you use. That is all in the laws of organic. So when you purchase organic agriculture, you know how the food is being grown. And you know that certain things are not happening. They are not GMO products. Et cetera, and we could talk for hours on what organic means. Having said that, there is a little bit of a negative side to organic agriculture, and that is because it is a legal system, you have to keep very good records of everything you're doing, et cetera, and that sometimes for the smaller agricultural producers is just overwhelming. It's just too much for them to do. And so some people will argue that organic was really written to benefit larger agricultural organizations. Again, one of those things, I've met many farmers who will tell me my produce is organic because I've grown it that way forever, but I can't call it that because I haven't done all the paperwork for verification. Biodiversity and the whole issue of heirlooms. Now, we have lost a lot of biodiversity, as we've seen earlier, and this really impacts me as the chef, okay? There are in the world about 4,000 varieties of apples. I've had the privilege of eating many of those, actually. But if you look at what is grown commercially, because remember in industrial agriculture, we want things that are the same size and shippable and storable. What happens is we lose the ability to have products that are really interesting. And so when we lose biodiversity, that's an issue. And heirlooms really refers to those plants that we used to have. The statistics on how much we've lost are amazing. Slow food will tell you that we've lost 75% of genetic diversity in agricultural plants since the beginning of the 20th century. 75%. And this is, out of the 300,000 plant varieties that are edible, we have lost so many, and so many have become extinct because of this, because we've favored certain cultivars. So again, seed banks are trying to rescue a lot of these and have them for future times. But as chefs, this is something that we need to get behind and support, because these are really interesting products. They're very delicious. And in doing so, we bring higher quality, more interesting food to our customers. And at the same time, we help to support biodiversity. So back to this difficult term of local. What does local mean? Again, there's no definition of this, but I think we can sort of understand what that means, and that is purchasing food that is grown within a close proximity to the restaurant. Maybe it's even food that we produce ourselves. And there are pros and cons to this. Certainly, there are, some of the advantages of this is that's where you'll tend to see a lot of heirlooms. We support local economies, and we keep those smaller farmers in business doing things that are a little bit different. It's a little bit more customer related. Producer consumer, the relationship is stronger. I know who's making my food, and that's a very important part. It also many times results in fresher food. Now, there are cons to this, because remember, everything isn't just black and white. Many times costs are higher. We do have to look at things like seasonal availability, and sourcing can become difficult. Distribution can become difficult, and we're going to talk about that on some subsequent slides here. But I will tell you on a personal note, I have seen what happens when there are not distribution systems for local foods. And from a food service perspective, as a chef, as a busy chef, calling up every farmer, and that becomes really difficult for many, many places. And so there are now increasing numbers of companies that are serving as a distributor of local food. And so as a result, me, the chef, I just have to call that one distributor, and that one distributor then deals with each of the farmers. It's a very good way to do it. And in your parts of the world, if that doesn't exist, if there is a breakdown between the local producers and the chefs, you have the power of the white jacket. So see what you can do to try to foster a relationship where somebody can become that distributor, or maybe even you could be. So seasonality, I think we have moved to a world where seasonality is less and less, quote unquote, important. We have decided that we want everything all year round. And I think that is a tremendous mistake. Again, it benefits large scale agriculture, et cetera, and certainly brings consistency to food service operations. At the same time, though, it also means that we tend to get food that is not at its height of flavor. We tend to get the same product over and over again. And quite frankly, the consumer is missing out on the waiting and the expectation of that product as it becomes available for 3 weeks or 4 weeks, and then it's gone, and then you have to wait. And in other words, when you can have the same thing all year round, it actually becomes boring. I think we have to look at how do we as chefs support seasonal produce. Now, seasonal can also mean, as you see here, there's greenhouses, hydroponics, aquaponics, etc. There's ways that we can still produce various foods locally, slightly out of season, or expand the season with things like hoop houses, or those little tiny greenhouses that cover rows of plants. There's things that we can do to extend that seasonality a little bit. But I think we as chefs need to get behind this. Now, in places like Chicago, where it snows for part of the year and nothing grows, seasonality becomes more challenging. At the same time, what an amazing opportunity for chefs to become creative, for chefs to think about, how can I, serve food that was dried or canned or pickled or fermented. And fermentation, as you all know, is one of the darlings of the chef societies today around the world. So I think where this goes is that it actually, in learning how to cook seasonally, it allows for creativity on the part of the chef. So food transportation is an issue I'm going to touch on briefly. There's so much we could talk about here, but suffice it to say that when we deal with local, we tend to get food that has a higher nutritional value, as you can see from the slide here. But there's a term in here I want to be sure that we understand, and that is something called food miles. And when people talk about food miles, people think that that means the distance from where the food is grown to where it is ultimately consumed. And that is not necessarily the best definition. It's really a question of how much energy is needed to move the food from one point to the point where it's ultimately consumed. It's about energy consumption. Remember, everything is connected. And in our very globally connected world, it's not that we will be able to buy everything locally. We are an interconnected global world. But what is important to understand is that how the food is shipped will change the energy inputs dramatically. For instance, if I put food on a train and I send it on a train, that is a very efficient and low energy way of moving food. If I put food on a small truck and I drive it a long distance, that is not a good use of energy. And that actually is high food miles. Or pretty much the worst of all is to be flying food around the world. And that's one thing as chefs, if we can think about how much food do we get that is flown to us, that's, I think, where we really need to focus. So if we look at these two systems and we sort of say on the one side is agricultural, on the other side is ecological, and you can pretty much see that there are benefits and there are costs associated with both. And most experts who look at how are we going to feed this growing population of the world will say there needs to be a place for both. And maybe the best way is something that's in the middle. Because I have personally witnessed large industrial agriculture systems that are doing everything possible to truly minimize the amount of pesticides and fertilizers that are put on the fields through the use of some absolutely mind-boggling technology. And as a result, we're not getting nitrogen runoff, and the pesticides that are used are very very minimal, et cetera, et cetera. I think that it's not an either or necessarily. I think we always as chefs need to look at how we can support ecological agriculture, but I also think we have to be open to other types of systems that truly try to produce the food we need, but do it in a way that's not damaging to the ecosystems around it. So this is the last slide for today, and this is getting into what we can do as chefs and as cooks. So there's a bunch of ideas here. I'm going to go through them relatively quickly, but the first is don't fear technology and what is new. There are things that are happening in the agricultural world that are absolutely incredible. And while we talk about things like heirlooms and what was done in the past, of which many of that is really interesting, at the same time, we also need to keep our minds open about what is changing and what is changing to benefit us. try to grow your own food. Now that, there's a lot of chefs that are putting food in their, restaurants, on roofs, etc. I also know chefs who are actually getting involved in farming. And that is something that obviously everybody can't do, but it's interesting. Limit packaging. Now we're going to talk more about this on day number 7, but sometimes the amount of packaging that comes with the food that is delivered to your restaurant is excessive. And we have the power of the white jacket, and we have the power of what we purchase. So if you see excessive packaging, excessive use of plastics, etc., tell your producer that if they don't change, you're not going to buy it, and watch what happens. And then get your chef association involved as well. Feature foods that are produced locally. This is great. Obviously, we want to support local. And it also helps you get to know who the producers are, and please talk to them about their commitment to sustainable agriculture and what that means to them. Find trustworthy producers. It's all about trust, whether that's a distributor or the people who are growing for you, and make sure that they're fair to the people who grow the food for them. Remember, we are the chefs, and we are the ones who can create demand for these products. So many times it's not about waiting for the farmer, but we can also tell our producers the things that we want to see, because that tells the farmers what they should be growing for us. Create menus that feature and call out local agriculture. On your menus, talk about where the food came from. Feature the farmer. Talk about why it's special. Educate your clients. And what's interesting about that is that many times the clients will pay a little bit more for something that is special and that is seen as unique. Let them know what you're doing. And beware of buying always the most inexpensive products. There are hidden costs behind that, hidden costs to the environment. So think about, where should you be paying more for unique and well-raised products that will, help attract customers, that will help you market your restaurant and will make people want to come to you. Seek out diversity of products. We talked about that. And by the way, commodity foods aren't necessarily, we all use them. We all, need flour and we need sugar and all that stuff. But ask about how they're produced. Be informed. And lastly, use your chef skills. We are chefs. We're creative. Use your skills to really make the vegetables and the fruits shine on your plate and not just be an afterthought, but to be the focus of delicious, delicious cuisine. And that will lead us into what we're going to talk about tomorrow as we get into the whole animal husbandry piece and how much animal protein should we be eating, because vegetables and fruits should play a very large, and grains of course, a very large role in that. So we'll be talking all about that tomorrow. But remember, chefs, you have the power. You have the power to affect what's around you. You have the power to make great food and to change the world. Thank you. And that concludes today's class on agriculture. Again, that was a ton of information, but you will have the PowerPoint and or actually PDF, whatever. I encourage you to please go through that and look at it again, because I think that there is a lot there that we went through today. So with that, I'm going to end this portion of today. I want to so sincerely thank every one of you from all over this great world who have taken the time to be part of this. It means more than you can imagine to me. And together, as a group, as World Chefs, we get to change the world.